Hey, what's going on, gang? This is Nate on the Stone. Welcome back to my channel. And this week we're talking about how the wall of separation between church and state has been abused, leading up to the ridiculousness that we're going to be talking about today. We all grew up learning about the wall of separation and how that was one of the major things that differentiated America from the rest of Europe. 18th century Europe, by and large, had established churches that were part of the social order, and more often than not too, if you didn't belong to that official established church and religion, you were going to be oppressed in some way, shape, or form. Catholics in Ireland, under British rule, for example, were forbidden to vote, forbidden to own land. They couldn't even own looms to make their own clothes. Those had to be rented from their, of course, British landlords. Over in France, there was the St. Bartholomew Days massacre. Geneva, Switzerland, under John Calvin, suppressed pretty much anyone who wasn't a Calvinist. And of course, there were the wars of religion in the 16th century. The founders and framers looked at that big mishava and said, "No thanks, we've got something else in mind," and created the secular public square with the wall of separation between church and state. That's at least what we've been taught. Well, that idea is now going into overdrive because the argument that's being put forward now is that Christian high schools can't broadcast a simple prayer before a school football game because, are you ready for this, gang? Because broadcasting the prayer before the football game would require using a public PA system. No joke, I found 2 public cases of this argument being pushed forward for specifically these circumstances. The first one comes from Florida. In 2015, the Florida High School Athletic Association told University Christian and Cambridge Christian high schools that they could no longer use their respective public PA systems to broadcast their traditional prayers before school games. The executive director of the FHSAA, Roger Deering, gave 2 reasons for this decision in an email which he sent to both schools, where he said, quote, "First, the fact that the facility is a public facility, predominantly paid for with public tax dollars, makes the facility off limits under federal guidelines and precedent court cases. Second is the fact that in Florida statutes, the FHSAA, host and coordinator of the event, is legally a state actor. We cannot legally permit or grant permission for such an activity." The second example actually comes from this year. The Loans High School in Georgia also had a tradition of broadcasting a simple prayer before their football games. But in September, an anonymous parent complained to the Freedom From Religion Foundation. Think of the FFRF as the arch nemesis of the Alliance Defending Freedom, with the Alliance fighting to protect religious liberty, and the FFRF fighting to keep religion in the box of a person's mind or in the 4 walls of their church. The FFRF promptly told the school to jump. The school responded with, "How high, sir?" and the tradition was immediately axed. FFRF attorney Chris Line argued, quote, "I couldn't go to the football game and say, 'Hey, there is no God,' to everybody at the game. Use the school's microphone for that. In the same way that a Christian cannot come up and deliver a Christian prayer for everyone when the crowd probably has Jewish people, Muslims, obviously atheists, and tons of other minority religions." To recap all of this, gang, according to the FHSAA and the FFRF, the problem isn't that people are praying before school games. No. The problem is that they are using school and therefore public property to broadcast their prayers, thereby making the state a player in actively promoting a religion, thereby actively breaking the First Amendment. In other words, the wall of separation between church and state is so frail and so fragile that a simple prayer broadcasted over a microphone in a PA system before a high school football game is enough to send us down the trail of living in a Handmaid's Tale style theocracy. Is he though? The problem with these cases, with these arguments, and with the whole fad of treating anything even slightly religious in the public square as a danger to the wall of separation is that they're all hogwash. I usually try to be a bit more diplomatic when I say these things, but honestly, that's the only word that accurately describes them and still keeps this channel family friendly. In the first place, the wall of separation, technically speaking, isn't even part of the Constitution. The First Amendment simply says that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In other words, Congress tomorrow can't suddenly declare that the Methodist Church or Zoroastrianism is now the official church and or religion of the United States, much like the Anglican Church, aka the Church of England, is still the official church and religion of the United Kingdom. No, the actual articulation of the wall of separation between church and state actually comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote as president to the Baptist community of Danbury, Connecticut. And honestly, this is usually the point of the story where people on the right stop. But we have got to go further today because, more importantly, the wall that Jefferson talked about to the Danbury Baptists is not at all what ideologues are talking about when they speak of the wall of separation between church and state. I really need to point out here at this point that the idea of the spiritual and temporal realms being separate, it's not an invention of Thomas Jefferson. It's not even an American invention. This was first articulated by, of all people, a Catholic Pope, Gelasius I, in 494 AD. As Paul DeHart, an associated professor of political philosophy, says over at The Public Discourse, a terrific website, by the way, highly recommended, the ancient world was full of what the historian Francis Oakley called sacral monarchy, where the ruler was seen as either divine himself or at the very least as the special emissary of the gods. Egyptian pharaohs in this light were seen as the bodily incarnation of the god Horus. Roman emperors were associated with the sun god, etc., etc. But Pope Gelasius, in his Two Swords doctrine, held that there were two principal powers in the world. There was the temporal and there was the spiritual or religious, and that as two separate entities, each one had its own duties, responsibilities, powers, and rights, going so far even as to say that temporal rulers, quote, have only the power to judge temporal matters and have no competence in divine affairs. This idea was so revolutionary that Francis Oakley, the historian, called it the Christian apostasy, and this quickly became Christian tradition, never mind what stereotypes we might have had about early Christianity or the Middle Ages in particular. After the Middle Ages, the Puritans believed that a hedge, as they called it, should exist between the church and the state. And I'll bet that you thought that the Puritans were just a bunch of sourpussed, fun-hating, stuck-up stick-in-the-muds, which is totally an unjust caricature because, as the late great American historian Edmund Morgan pointed out, but you know what, that's probably a different topic for another time. Yeah, we'll save that for later. Roger Williams, the founder of the colony of Rhode Island, believed in the Puritans' hedge, saying, quote, "The faithful labors of many witnesses of Jesus Christ extend to the world, abundantly proving that the Church of the Jews under the Old Testament in the type, and the Church of the Christians under the New Testament in the antitype, were both separate from the world, and that when they have opened a gap in the hedge or wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, God hath ever broke down the wall itself, removed the candlestick, and made his garden a wilderness, as at this day." In other words, the wall or hedge of separation between the spiritual and temporal powers wasn't put in place to protect the state from religion or from the church. It was actually to protect the church from the godlessness of the world. And this is the idea that the founders and the framers inherited, and this is the idea that they put into the Constitution. Daniel L. Dreisbach, in his book, Thomas Jefferson and the Wall of Separation Between Church and State, says that Jefferson's wall was a metaphorical image of the First Amendment, but that this wall, this metaphor, was never meant to mean that religion had to be completely separated from the public square. Instead, this was a wall created to protect federalism, the separation of powers between the federal government and the different state governments. We chronological snobs here on the 21st century have to remember that Americans of the 18th century were very, very suspicious of the Constitution. Anything that gave the federal or national government more power was treated as a four-bell alarm, especially since the entire revolution was seen as the American response to the King and Parliament in London trying to take more power for themselves. That's an oversimplification in and of itself, but again, another topic, another time. The Constitution was only eventually ratified by a supermajority of the states after it was promised that a Bill of Rights would be attached to the Constitution, a Bill of Rights that would ensure two things. First, it would ensure that the federal government would not be able to encroach upon the civil and religious liberties of individual Americans. And two, it would ensure that the federal government would not be able to encroach upon the jurisdictions of the different state governments. And this is exactly how it was seen from the very beginning. The First Amendment was never intended to completely divorce religious belief or expression from the public sphere, or even from the government itself. Case in point. When the House of Representatives ratified the Bill of Rights, Congressman Elias Boudinot, who later became president of the American Bible Society, he proposed that President George Washington proclaim a day of thanksgiving and prayer. But when the idea was opposed, because, that's what those European cohorts across the ocean do, Congressman Roger Sherman, who was actually a signer of both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, Roger Sherman, quote, justified the practice of Thanksgiving on any single event, not only as a laudable one in itself, but as warranted by a number of precedents in Holy Writ. For instance, the solemn thanksgivings and rejoicings which took place in the time of Solomon after the building of the temple was a case in point. This example he thought worthy of Christian imitation on the present occasion, and he would agree with the gentleman who moved the resolution. The House agreed with Sherman, the Senate agreed with the House, and President George Washington, the President George Washington, agreed with Congress, and the result was his October 3rd, 1789 Proclamation of Thanksgiving, which read in part, quote, whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor, I do recommend the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being, who is the beneficent author of all the good that was, that is, or that will be. Washington also had no trouble with the federal government paying the salaries of military chaplains, and he sowed his official correspondence and speeches with religious language, like his first inaugural address, where he out and out said that it would be improper for him to omit any mention of or omit any supplication to God. So what happened? How did we go from that to what we have now? Well, the short answer is the Supreme Court. That's what happened.
Ain't it always the way?
In 1947, when the court decided the case Everson versus Board of Education, Justice Hugo Black took Jefferson's Wall and made it quote-unquote high and impregnable, with the majority of that case going even further, saying, quote, we could not approve the slightest breach. But as others have pointed out, what the court actually did here was perform a very slick bit of prestidigitation, where Jefferson and the Framers' Wall, or hedge as Roger Williams had called it, had just been between churches and the federal government. The 1947 Supreme Court turned it into a Berlin Wall between all civil government on all levels and religion in general, not just churches. So really the reason why the Florida High School Athletic Association and the Freedom From Religion Foundation can say that Christian high schools can't broadcast a simple prayer over their PA systems before a football game because that violates the wall of separation of church and state, the reason why we're in that situation is because since 1947, we've been living a lie. We've been living under the shadow of a wall completely different from what the founders and framers inherited and intended. They would be completely aghast at the idea that a high school, a Christian high school moreover, using a microphone to say a simple prayer before a sporting event violated the First Amendment. And it's more than time that we destroyed that lie. But what say you? Is the system that was created by the founders and framers the commonsensical one? Or is the FFRF right? And any breach in that high, impregnable wall going to take us down to the path of theocracy? As always, let me know your thoughts, ideas, comments, and opinions down in the box below. Well, that about wraps up everything for right now, gang. As always, if you liked the video, whether you agreed with me or not, don't forget to show your support by giving it a like, leaving a comment, and sharing it on all the social media platforms. And if you like videos about the culture, politics, and religion, but from a different POV, then think about subscribing to the channel and ringing the bell for notifications so that you'll always know when I post new videos like this every Tuesday. Videos you're not going to want to miss. As always, thank you for watching, for giving me a bit of your day. Thank you to all of my subscribers. I appreciate you all. And I will see you all again here next week, gang, on top of the stone. Ciao.